welcome to the Hobby Second Breakfast Show. In today's episode we're going to be ranking the different melee damage of various Sabre users in Star Wars Legion. Now, to make this video, what I've done is I've taken the, I think, 17 different Sabre users, including the Darksaber, in Star Wars Legion, and I've ranked them against each other. Now, the sort of criteria I was considering is basically only considering them in melee, and I've put them against like an attack versus defending against versus white defense die, red defense die, and then giving them something like an aim token as well, and I've considered that as well, and then put them up against armor and up against if they've got different armor with white dice, and against impervious, and also against things like immune, pierce, and things like that. So considered, I think, 11 or 12 categories in all, and basically for each of them I just put their sort of melee weapon into Tell Me the Odds, which is like a little tool for Legion that tells you how many wounds you would expect to do if you were to attack into that defense die with a specific weapon. Then what I did is I just summed up all their scores in different categories and then put them into sort of a list comparing them against each other. Now, before I start, I'll just go over a few ones that are sort of missing from here that you might expect to be in here, and I'll just explain why they've not been included. The first one is, for these rankings, I've not allowed them to have any kind of effect from a command card, and I've not given them the benefit of attacking twice in the case of Yoda. Part of the reason for this is that if you let Yoda have his 2 attacks, he becomes the best Sabre user in every single category, and it's not even close. So obviously the score here is completely arbitrary, but the average score was about sort of 39, and the highest score apart from Yoda was at 46. Yoda's score would have been 68, so he'd have been really far ahead of everybody else, and it just didn't seem like a particularly relevant comparison. But yeah, if you do want to include that, then he becomes objectively the best. Other ones, so for instance, Ventress won't get her Makashi Mastery from her command card, and Anakin won't get Surge to Crit as well from his command card. So yeah, just if you're wondering why those might be missing. But yeah, let's get into the rankings. So at the very bottom is going to be Sabine, Wren, and Gideon when they're armed with the Darksaber. So both of these units get 5 black dice with Surge to Crit, Impact 1, and Pierce 1. And while the actual dice pool isn't too bad, 5 black is okay, it's not that far off what we'll be seeing later on from lots of other Force users. Where they really fall down is in their keywords. So they only get Impact 1 and Pierce 1, whereas virtually every other unit we're going to be looking at here gets Impact 2, Pierce 2, and sometimes even better than that. And that just ends up really costing them in terms of like consistency and the damage they're going to be dealing. So they were below average and well below average in every single category, and in fact I think they were actually the worst in virtually every single category. So their sort of score, again, the sort of score here is kind of completely arbitrary. It doesn't really mean anything, but for reference, their score was 28.9, which isn't great in this aspect between those 12 categories. Moving up a tier into sort of equal 14th place, as it sort of works out with the ranking, is the 5th brother and the 7th sister. They have identical lightsabers. Obviously, a 5th brother benefits from Ram, but he's not going to be getting Ram here. We're only just considering a basic attack. So they have 5 black dice with Surge to hit, and they get Impact 2 and Pierce 1. So they are actually very, very similar to Sabine and Gideon. They rank really low in most categories. They do marginally better against armor just because they have Impact 2, so they're just slightly more consistent against armor. But in almost every other category, they're virtually identical, and their score ends up being 29.5. Is worth noting that because these 2 units, 5th brother, 7th sister, are so cheap, they both score really, really well in terms of like the points you're paying per unit of damage, if that makes sense. So for instance, because these 2 are quite cheap, I think they're down at like 110, 105-ish, you do get lots of damage for each point you pay, basically. So basically they ranked right at the top for kind of the value you're getting per damage you deal. So while they are obviously quite weak here, there is kind of a reason for that because they are quite cheap. Whereas Sabine and Gideon, because you end up paying a bit of a premium for both of them, compared to these 2 units, you do lose out in terms of that value from the damage you're getting. The next unit up, and this is kind of why I put the caveat in at the beginning, is Yoda. Yoda has a really has a strong dice pool, really consistent 4 red with Surge to Crit, Impact 2, Pierce 2. You're pretty reliably going to be getting those 4 hits in with that Surge to Crit, and with Impact 2 and Pierce 2, you'd hope those wounds do go through. But in order to take that damage kind of up to competing with all the others, you kind of do need to be attacking twice. And while obviously in a lot of situations that will be happening here, because I was just considering one attack, that does mean that unfortunately Yoda ranks quite low. Moving up to the next tier, it's going to be Obi Wan. Now, Obi Wan's saber isn't bad, isn't great, and he is definitely in the lower half here. So he gets 2 red, 2 black, 2 white with impact 2, pierce 2, and critical 2. Key bit here is that critical 2, because where he loses out on is obviously a lot of the time, and actually it's very unlikely you roll more than just those to surge rolls to turn them into criticals, but on the occasions you do, those won't be turning into hits. And while that is definitely very rare, it is something that hurts Obi-Wan here in this ranking. He scores fairly well. Like he's kind of the first one that's kind of in the kind of average and just below average category. He does okay against armor because he has that critical keyword and because he has impact. So like he does all right, but not brilliant. And in lots of other categories against red die and particularly against like pierce and immune to pierce, he really does struggle to kind of keep up with all the other ones. So his score was 38.9. So you can always see how he's kind of jumped up a bit compared to the ones below him. But yeah, he's still not on the level of some of the ones we're going to look at later on. Next one is going to be, it's actually kind of a two-way tie here. Grievous is slightly above them between Maul and Ventress. Now, this is Maul in his double-bladed saber form with 4 red and 4 white, and Ventress with her 8 black. Now, these two dice balls are actually identical. They do, in terms of like the damage you would expect, they both score 39.1. They both have kind of upsides and downside for red, for white. But actually, if you look at the number of hits, they should be almost exactly the same in virtually every scenario. Because they don't surge, you're just looking at impact 2 and pierce 2. So it's kind of a bit of, there's quite high variance with these rolls essentially. Like you could roll super hot and get loads of hits through. You could also completely fluff, especially with Maul's 4 white dice, like you are kind of reaching with those ones there. These guys, because they don't have those surges, they do tend to struggle versus armor. Where they're at their strongest is with an aim token against kind of a massed horde of troops, which I guess makes sense. So they actually scored above average against troops with white saves and against troops with red saves when they had that armor token that aim token, sorry, to increase their consistency. Marginally above them is Grievous. Again, he actually has kind of an almost identical dice pool when you look at the number of faces and the wounds you'd expect from 2 red, 4 black, 2 white. Where he does slightly better is again against, he rolls well against troops, and he actually does marginally better when he has that aim token to support him than those two. It is very close. I might link the spreadsheet in the description below so you can see what I'm talking about, but I'll flash up kind of the key statistics for each of them so you can probably see them now. The next tier up is actually a 3-way tie between Maul with a Darksaber, Commander Luke, and Ahsoka. Now, Commander Luke and Maul with the Darksaber have identical dice pools, both 6 black, surge to crit, impact 2, pierce 2. Ahsoka gets 2 red, 2 black, 2 white. She isn't benefiting from her Jarkai Mastery here because, again, there wasn't a category that let them have a dodge token. So, yeah, may or may not be fair. These guys did slightly worse than the previous 3 in terms of against troopers. So they don't, because they have smaller dice pools, but with kind of higher quality dice with that surge to crit, they don't do as well against kind of massed hordes, but they do significantly better against armor. And that surge to crit really helps them. In fact, these guys were actually in second position overall in terms of like the damage they deal versus armor because of that surge to crit. It gives them a really nice boost. But yeah, they score 39.5, so you can see very marginally above Grevious on 39.4. So it is very, very close in kind of this middle section with lots of Sabre users with very similar dice pools and very similar damage outputs. Moving up, and this is kind of moving into the top places now. So in equal 4th, we have Operative Vader and Anakin. Now, The high quality kind of small dice pool is what we're going to be looking at with the next couple. So 5 red with impact 3, pierce 3. Where they excel is basically against, they perform really well against kind of large groups of trooper units with saving red dice, because they can get rid of those saves. So they score well above average in those categories. Unfortunately, because they only have 5 dice, the aim doesn't actually impact them that much, because they're putting through so many hits anyway. Whereas, like with, for instance, with Operative Luke, Commander Luke, or like, you know, Maul and Ventress, that aim token makes a huge difference. With these guys, not quite so much, because they have that high quality dice pool anyway. Impact 3, Pierce 3, really, really good against armor. Like, these guys actually were nearly at the top. There's only one above them in terms of their damage versus armor, and especially when you give them that aim, their damage against armor is really, really strong. So overall, their score was 41.2. Again, this scale completely arbitrary, just gives you some element of comparison to the other units there. Moving into the top 3. In third place, we have Count Dooku. He is 5 red dice with surge to crit. Super nice, that surge to crit. Again, not perhaps as relevant with the red dice as with the other dice pools, but for getting that consistency, and again, going through armor, that's really nice. The key bit here, though, is his Makashi Mastery, because what this enables him to do is it makes him the best unit in the game, apart from double attacking Yoda, against immune pierce units, and he is way above everybody else, because effectively that immune pierce just gives you an extra damage going through. So with his dice pool, you'd actually expect to put over 3 hits through on a unit with immune pierce, which is super nice, and like, that's really consistent. Most other units would be expecting kind of low 2s, high 1s, whereas his is 3.1, which is well above average. Against everything else, he's kind of fine. Like, he does okay against units with saving white dice. He does only have impact 2, pierce 2 in this category, which does obviously hurt him compared to like Vader and Anakin, for instance. Moving into second place, I can't imagine there'll be too many surprises here. It's probably actually just which way around you're expecting these to be. It is Operative Luke. That 7 black with surge to crit is absolutely crazy. Like, when you're high rolling, unfortunately, he just loses out in terms of like his consistency. So what you'd expect. Obviously, if you're rolling hot, he's probably one of the best. He probably is the best unit in the game. But if you're not rolling super hot, he's less consistent. Where he does really well is again against units with large units against white dice, because he doesn't have that pierce 3 that really sets you apart against those red dice saving units. But when you give him that aim token, his damage absolutely shoots up, and he does so much damage. He is the best unit in the game once you give him an aim token against armor. So just because he has that surge to crit, the odds of it goes up a lot, and he'll be putting over 4 hits through versus a unit with armor and a white save. He also does okay versus units with immune pierce, because he isn't as reliant on immune pierce he isn't as reliant on pierce as other units are in this kind of top section of the list. His damage doesn't drop off that much, and actually he's second only to Dooku in terms of damage versus units with immune pierce. But you can probably guess what the top one is. It is going to be Commander Vader. He is the top unit in, I think, 9 out of the 12 categories. So he's the best unit in the game, flat against units with white or red defense die. He's the best unit in the game against most units versus armor. He only loses out to Luke, who sort of jumps him when you give him that aim token, because that really increases Luke's damage, where it doesn't have such a big impact on Vader. And he is the best unit in the game against impervious, and he's third behind Luke and Dooku against units with immune pierce. His score is 46.7, so you can see he's taken a bit of a jump ahead of Luke. Obviously, you do pay a premium for that. Like, he is one of the most expensive units in the game, and you do pay for that saber damage, but that 6 red with impact 3 and pierce 3 is such a large and consistent dice pool that your damage is going to be pretty crazy. So yeah, in terms of like how how this ends up playing out, I think in terms of like the value these units are giving you, there are some outliers. So even though Jedi Luke does a lot of damage because he is quite expensive, especially when you've put kit on him and things like that, his damage doesn't end up being like that crazy in terms of value. Whereas like those cheaper units, for instance, like the Fifth Brother and Seventh Sister, actually do represent pretty good value for their points. So that brings us to the end of the video. Thank you for listening. Was kind of planning to carry on this series, but I'm not quite sure where we're going to go next. I've had a look at a few other options. So, for instance, I had a look at like ranged weapons. So, for instance, ranged heroes, and maybe even looking at corpse units, core units as well. Sorry, not corpse. The problem with that is though, is it starts to get really complicated when you start to look at ranged options because of cover. The advantage with melee was didn't have to consider cover, so it made things a lot more straightforward. But as soon as you're bringing in like things in light and heavy cover, and like even special rules like marksman, it starts to get really complicated, and it would end up being like sort of 30, 40 categories, and I just don't know if I have the time or the patience to go and work through that. So let me know if you think that'd be something worth going through. As I say, this video is a bit of a rogue video, and it's just something that like I was interested in theory crafting. But yeah, let me know in the comments below, and I can always put a link to the spreadsheet as well if you want to have a look at how I've come up with these rankings. But yeah, thank you for listening. I'll see you for the next one.